The old town of Havenridge had a curse, but no one spoke of it. Nestled between dense forests and fog-laden hills, the town was shrouded in legends of things that roamed the woods once the sun went down. The stories, passed down for generations, warned of creatures that fed on fear and blood. But for years, these stories had faded into mere ghost tales told to children around campfires. People went about their lives, content with their quiet, uneventful existence, until the night of the blood moon. The crimson glow bathed the town in an eerie light, painting everything in shades of red. It wasn't just the moon, though. It was something else. There was a chill in the air, colder than any autumn night should be. The woods whispered strange sounds that made the hairs on the back of people's necks stand. That's when it started. A scream echoed through the town, piercing the thick silence like a knife. It came from the outskirts, where the town met the forest, where no one dared to go after dark. Mark Sullivan jolted awake, heart pounding in his chest. The scream, high-pitched and filled with terror, sliced through the night again. His wife, Claire, stirred beside him. "What was that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer immediately. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and peered out of the window. The blood moon hung ominously in the sky, casting long, dark shadows over the trees. "I don't know," Mark replied finally, his gut knotting with unease. Claire sat up, pulling the blanket tight around her. "Do you think it's just one of the animals?" Mark wanted to say yes, but the scream hadn't sounded like any animal he knew. It sounded like someone was in trouble, someone afraid for their life. "I'll check it out," Mark said, pulling on his boots. Claire reached for his hand, her grip tight. "Be careful. Don't go too far." He nodded, kissed her forehead, and grabbed his flashlight before stepping outside. The cold hit him instantly, the wind biting at his skin. He stood for a moment, listening. Another scream, this time closer. Mark's pulse quickened. He hurried down the porch steps, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The town square was deserted, most people still fast asleep, unaware of the looming danger. His footsteps echoed as he made his way towards the woods at the edge of town. He saw movement in the shadows. "Hello," Mark called out, his voice shaky. The shadows stopped, freezing in place. For a brief second, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But then, something stepped out from the darkness. A woman. Her clothes were torn, her hair wild, and her eyes wide with terror. She stumbled towards him, blood dripping from her arm. "Help me," she gasped, collapsing at his feet. Mark knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "What happened? Who did this?" "They're coming," she whispered, her eyes glazed with fear. "They're coming for us all." Before Mark could ask her anything more, her body went limp, her breath shallow. Panic surged in his chest. He hoisted her up and started towards the town, his mind racing. As he approached the town square, he heard it, a low growl. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. He turned his flashlight towards the sound. A pair of glowing red eyes stared back at him from the darkness. And then, the creature emerged. Mark's blood ran cold. The creature stood motionless, watching him. Its eyes, glowing crimson in the moonlight, sent waves of terror crashing over Mark. It was tall, inhumanly tall, with pale, almost translucent skin that seemed to shimmer under the blood moon. Sharp, elongated fangs protruded from its mouth, gleaming like knives. Mark's throat tightened as he took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman in his arms stirred, barely conscious, mumbling incoherent words as her blood stained Mark's shirt. Suddenly, the creature lunged. Mark barely had time to react. He turned and ran, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. The creature's footsteps thudded behind him, gaining on him with unnatural speed. He could feel its hot breath on the back of his neck, its presence suffocating him with dread. In desperation, Mark sprinted towards the church. Its ancient stone walls had stood in Havenridge for centuries, a sanctuary in times of crisis. He burst through the wooden doors and slammed them shut just as the creature reached them. The sound of its claws scraping against the door sent a chill down his spine. Mark collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his ears. The woman lay unconscious beside him, her breathing shallow. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. Silence. But the creature was still out there. He could feel it. Mark grabbed a pew and pushed it against the door, barricading it as best he could. He needed to get help, to warn the others. But as he turned towards the altar, a sinking realization hit him. There was no way to explain what he had just seen. No one would believe him. The blood moon hung in the sky, casting its eerie glow through the stained glass windows, filling the church with a crimson light. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the building sending a jolt of fear through Mark. He sat down beside the woman, checking her pulse. It was weak, but she was alive for now. He didn't even know her name. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered to himself, rubbing his temples. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. She grabbed Mark's arm with surprising strength, her nails digging into his skin. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The vampires. They've come back." Mark stared at her in disbelief. Vampires? It couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, but the look in her eyes told him otherwise. The town of Havenridge was oblivious to the terror lurking on its doorstep. Most of the townspeople were fast asleep in their beds, unaware of the blood moon's sinister glow or the creatures that had awakened in the shadows. But by morning, that would change. Mark couldn't stay in the church forever. He had to get help. He glanced at the woman, still unconscious, her breath shallow and labored. She had warned him about vampires, but the notion seemed absurd. Yet, what else could explain what he had seen? With a deep breath, Mark pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff's number. The line rang several times before Sheriff Dalton picked up, his voice groggy from sleep. "Sheriff, it's Mark. You need to get to the church. Now." "What's going on?" the sheriff asked, yawning. "There's something out there. A woman's hurt, and I think there's more. Something dangerous." Mark struggled to find the words without sounding like he had lost his mind. "I'll be there in 10, Sheriff Dalton said, his voice suddenly alert. Mark hung up and glanced back at the woman, her pale skin illuminated by the dim light of the church. He hoped the sheriff would believe him, or at least see the truth for himself. Minutes later, the sound of a car engine echoed through the empty streets. Mark peered out of the window to see the sheriff's car pull up outside. Sheriff Dalton stepped out, a flashlight in hand, his eyes scanning the area cautiously. Mark hurried to the door, unbarricading it just enough to let him inside. "What happened?" the sheriff asked as he stepped in, his brow furrowed in concern. Mark gestured towards the unconscious woman. "I found her on the edge of town. Something attacked her, and I think it's still out there." Sheriff Dalton crouched beside the woman, checking her pulse. His expression hardened. "What do you mean, something? An animal?" "No, not an animal." Mark hesitated, unsure how to explain. "It looked like a man, but not human. It had red eyes and fangs." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure? I saw it with my own eyes." Sheriff Dalton stood, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Stay here with her. I'm going to take a look outside." Mark watched as the sheriff stepped cautiously into the night, his flashlight beam dancing over the shadows. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Mark paced the floor, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Then, suddenly, there was a shout from outside. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He grabbed a nearby candlestick, the only weapon he could find, and rushed outside. The sheriff stood in the middle of the street, his flashlight trained on a figure emerging from the shadows. Mark's blood ran cold. The figure stepping from the shadows was not alone. Behind it, more shapes emerged, their red eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. There were 6 of them, moving with unnatural grace, their pale skin almost blending with the night. Their fangs gleamed in the blood moon's eerie light. Sheriff Dalton stood frozen, his hand hovering over his gun, but Mark could see the fear in his eyes. The sheriff had no idea what he was up against. Mark gripped the candlestick tightly, his breath shallow. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice breaking the silence. Dalton turned his head slightly, but kept his eyes locked on the creatures. "Get back inside, Mark," he ordered, his voice low and tense. "I'll handle this." But Mark knew better. There was no handling this. Not with a gun, not with any weapon. These were vampires. The word felt foreign and absurd in his mind, but there was no denying what he had seen. And now, the sheriff was face to face with them. The lead vampire, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and glowing eyes, stepped forward, a twisted smile on his lips. "You shouldn't have come out," the vampire said, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "We don't want trouble. Not yet." Dalton swallowed hard. "Who are you? What do you want?" The vampire chuckled, his fangs visible under his thin lips. "We want what's ours." Before the sheriff could react, the vampire moved with lightning speed, grabbing him by the throat and lifting him off the ground. Dalton gasped for air, his legs kicking helplessly. Mark watched in horror, paralyzed by fear. He had to do something, but his body refused to move. The vampire leaned in close to the sheriff's ear. "Your blood is ours, Sheriff. All of you belong to us now." With a sickening crack, the vampire tossed Dalton aside like a rag doll. The sheriff's body hit the ground, lifeless and broken. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he was next. "Run," the woman's weak voice called from inside the church. "Run before it's too late." But Mark didn't run. He couldn't. The vampires were closing in, their eyes fixed on him. His grip tightened on the candlestick, knowing it wouldn't do much, but it was all he had. The lead vampire licked his lips, his eyes gleaming with hunger. "So much fear in you. It makes the blood taste sweeter." Mark took a step back, his mind racing. He had to think. He had to survive. But how? Suddenly, the church bell rang, a deafening sound that echoed through the town. The vampires flinched, their hands covering their ears, hissing in pain. Mark glanced back at the church, where the woman was now standing in the doorway, her hand on the rope that controlled the bell. "Get inside," she shouted, her voice hoarse but strong. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the church, the vampires momentarily distracted by the ringing. He barely made it through the door before the creatures regained their composure, their hisses filling the air. The woman slammed the door shut behind him, breathing heavily. "The bell, it keeps them away for a while. They can't stand the sound." Mark leaned against the door, his heart pounding. "What the hell is happening?" "They've returned," she said, sinking to the floor. "The vampires. They've come back to claim the town." Mark's mind was spinning. "What do you mean, Come back. How long has this been going on? The woman's eyes were filled with sorrow. Centuries. Havenridge has always been theirs, but the town elders struck a deal long ago. They were allowed to sleep, undisturbed, under the old mansion near the woods. But something woke them tonight. The blood moon, Mark muttered, realizing the connection. Yes, the woman whispered. The moon called to them, awakened them, and now they're hungry. As the minutes ticked by, Mark's panic began to ebb, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The woman, whose name was Alice, explained everything. How the vampires had ruled Havenridge centuries ago, feeding on the villagers until a group of elders had made a pact with them. In exchange for peace, the vampires would be sealed away, hidden deep within the earth beneath the old mansion. They would only awaken if the blood moon rose again. But why tonight? Mark asked, pacing the floor. What changed? Alice shook her head. I don't know, but the moon is different this time. Its light is stronger, darker. It's as if something disturbed the balance. Outside, the bells ringing began to fade, and the vampires' hissing grew louder. The church wouldn't hold them for long. We have to find a way to stop them, Mark said, desperation in his voice. Is there anything in the legends, anything at all, that can kill them? Alice closed her eyes, trying to remember the old tales. There was one thing, a weapon, hidden somewhere in the mansion. It was said to be forged from the blood of the first vampire. But it's just a myth. It's the only chance we have, Mark said, determination hardening his voice. We need to get to the mansion. Alice's face paled. The mansion is crawling with them. You'll never make it. I'll have to try. The journey to the mansion was treacherous. The blood moon's light bathed the landscape in a crimson hue, casting long, eerie shadows across the town. The streets were empty, but Mark could feel the eyes watching from the darkness, waiting for a moment to strike. Alice led the way, her steps cautious but steady. She knew the old paths, the hidden routes that the town's elders had used centuries ago. They moved quickly, staying out of sight as much as possible. When the mansion finally came into view, Mark's breath caught in his throat. It loomed before them like a dark, decaying monolith, its windows broken, its walls crumbling with age. But even in its ruined state, there was something menacing about it, a presence that made the air feel thick with malice. This is it, Alice whispered. The lair. Mark swallowed hard, gripping the wooden stake he had fashioned earlier. It was crude, but it was all he had. Together, they crept toward the mansion's entrance, the massive wooden doors hanging ajar. The scent of decay hit them as they stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. The only sound was the distant drip of water echoing through the hallways. They're here, Alice whispered, her voice barely audible. We need to find the weapon before they find us. Mark nodded, his heart pounding. The mansion was a maze of twisting corridors and hidden rooms, and every step felt like a step deeper into the jaws of death. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, and the faint whispers of the vampires seemed to follow them wherever they went. Finally, they reached an old library, its shelves lined with ancient books covered in dust. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a gleaming dagger, the weapon they had been searching for. Mark hurried to the pedestal, his hands shaking as he picked up the dagger. The blade was cold to the touch, its surface etched with strange symbols. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut. Mark spun around, his heart racing. The vampires had found them. The lead vampire stood at the doorway, his red eyes gleaming with malice. Behind him, the other vampires spread out, blocking every possible escape route. You thought you could run, the lead vampire said, his voice a sinister whisper. But this town has always belonged to us. Mark gripped the dagger tightly, stepping in front of Alice. "This ends tonight." The vampire laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're just a man. What can you possibly do against us?" Mark's hand trembled, but he didn't back down. The vampires moved closer, their fangs bared, their claws ready to tear him apart. In a flash, the lead vampire lunged, his movements so fast that Mark barely had time to react. But just as the creature reached him, Mark thrust the dagger forward, driving it into the vampire's chest. The vampire let out a piercing scream, his body convulsing as the dagger's power surged through him. His skin cracked and blackened, his eyes wide with shock. With a final, blood-curdling scream, the vampire crumbled into ash. The other vampires froze, their eyes filled with terror. Mark didn't wait. He charged at them, wielding the dagger with desperate fury. One by one, the vampires fell, their bodies disintegrating into dust as the dagger cut through them. When the last vampire was gone, Mark stood in the silence, panting and covered in sweat. The mansion was eerily quiet, the threat finally over. Alice stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You did it!" Mark collapsed to his knees, the weight of everything finally crashing down on him. "It's over," he whispered, barely able to believe it himself. Morning broke over Havenridge, the blood moon fading as the sun rose over the horizon. The town was silent, its streets empty, as if the events of the night had never happened. But Mark knew the truth. The vampires had been real, and their curse had almost destroyed the town. He stood in the town square, watching as the townspeople slowly emerged from their homes, unaware of the danger they had narrowly escaped. Alice stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. "It's over for now," she said, "but they'll always be out there, waiting." Mark nodded, his grip tightening on the dagger. He knew that this wasn't the end. The blood moon might rise again, and when it did, the vampires would return. But he would be ready. As the first rays of sunlight bathed the town in warmth, Mark walked back toward the church, the dagger clutched in his hand. The fear lingered, but so did the strength to fight back. The town of Havenridge would never be the same, and neither would he.